The Galactic Academy's xenobiology lecture hall buzzed with the usual mixture of clicks, chirps, and synthesized vocalizations as students from dozens of species settled into their bioadaptive seats. Marcus Chen adjusted his standard-issue breathing apparatus and tried to make himself invisible in the back row, just as he had for the past 3 months since arriving at this prestigious institution. Professor Zethkar, a towering Vorthan with crystalline skin that refracted the artificial lighting into rainbow patterns, activated the holographic display at the center of the amphitheater. Today's lesson focused on symbiotic relationships across the galaxy, and Marcus felt his stomach tighten with familiar dread. Today we examine the fascinating bonds between species that have evolved beyond mere coexistence, Professor Zethkar announced, her voice carrying the musical quality typical of her people. Some relationships are so profound they reshape the very nature of consciousness itself. A snicker came from the middle section where Crixtol sat with his usual group of followers. The insectoid's compound eyes glittered with malice as he turned to stare at Marcus. Speaking of primitive bonds, Crixtol's mandibles clicked in what passed for laughter among his kind. Perhaps our human specimen can enlighten us about his own unusual companion. The lecture hall fell silent. Even Professor Zethkar paused, her crystalline features reflecting uncertainty. Everyone knew about Marcus's companion, though few understood what they were actually seeing. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks as hundreds of alien eyes, optical sensors, and sensory organs focused on him. Beside him, seemingly asleep on the desk, lay what appeared to be an ordinary Earth dog, a medium-sized golden retriever with slightly graying fur around the muzzle. To everyone else in the room, Buddy looked exactly like what the Academy's databases classified as a domesticated canine companion species. "I don't understand the question," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely carrying across the vast space. Crixtol's chittering grew louder. "Oh, come now. We all know humans are the only species primitive enough to form emotional attachments to non-sentient creatures. It's quite fascinating from an anthropological perspective, really. Tell us, do you also collect shiny objects and mark territory with chemical secretions?" The laughter that followed came from multiple species, each expressing amusement in their own way. The Zephyrian's tentacles changed color in rapid pulses, while the crystalline Vorthans created a harmonic resonance that sounded like wind chimes in a storm. Marcus's hands clenched into fists under his desk. 3 months of this. 3 months of being the only human at the Academy, constantly reminded that his species was considered barely above primitive by galactic standards. Earth had only recently been contacted, only recently deemed worthy of limited educational exchange. He was here on sufferance, a curiosity to be studied. "That's enough," Professor Zethkar said, though her tone lacked conviction. Mr. Chen's cultural practices, however unusual, are not the subject of today's discussion. But Crixtol wasn't finished. "I'm simply curious about the psychological mechanisms involved. Does the creature provide emotional regulation? Does it help with basic problem solving? I've read that primitive species often." "He's not primitive," Marcus said, standing so quickly his chair scraped against the floor with a sound that made several sensitive species flinch. "And neither am I." The silence that followed was different now, charged with tension. Buddy raised his head for the first time during the lecture, brown eyes scanning the room with an alertness that seemed almost calculating. "Mr. Chen," Professor Zethkar said carefully, "perhaps you should." "No," Marcus interrupted, surprising himself with his own boldness. "I'm tired of this. Every day, the same jokes, the same assumptions. You think you understand Earth, understand humans, because you've read some reports and watched some video feeds. You think we're just another primitive species lucky enough to stumble into galactic civilization." Crixtol's mandibles spread in what Marcus had learned was the equivalent of a condescending smile. "Are we wrong? Your species hasn't even achieved basic neural networking. You still use verbal communication almost exclusively. And you form irrational attachments to creatures that can't even what?" Marcus challenged. "Think? Communicate? Contribute?" "Precisely," Crixtol said, gesturing toward Buddy with one of his forearms. "That creature possesses the intellectual capacity of a Zephyrian larva at best. The fact that your species evolved to find such limitations, comforting, tells us everything we need to know about human psychological development." More laughter rippled through the hall. Marcus felt his face burning with shame and anger. He looked down at Buddy, who was sitting now, head tilted as if listening to every word. For just a moment, Marcus could have sworn he saw something in those brown eyes, not the simple devotion of a pet, but something much more complex. "You want to know about human-canine relationships?" Marcus said, his voice getting stronger. "Fine. But you're not going to understand it by looking at database entries and species classifications." "Enlighten us then," Crickstoll said, settling back in his seat with obvious amusement. "Explain this mysterious bond." Marcus took a deep breath. "Buddy isn't just my pet. He's my partner. For thousands of years, humans and dogs evolved together. Not just alongside each other, together. We shaped each other's development in ways your databases can't quantify." "Touching," said a voice from the Aquilian section, where the bird-like species perched on specially designed stands. "But evolution doesn't create sentience where none exists. Your companion remains a non-sapient creature, regardless of your emotional investment." "Does he?" Marcus asked quietly. The question hung in the air. Several students exchanged glances, unsure where this was leading. Professor Zethkar cleared her throat. "Mr. Chen, while we appreciate your passion for your companion, biological facts remain unchanged. Your canine companion lacks the neural complexity for true sapience. The Academy's Xenobiological Committee was quite clear on this point when they approved your request to bring it aboard." "They tested him?" Marcus asked. "Standard scans, yes. Neural activity consistent with non-sapient mammalian life. Simple pattern recognition, basic emotional responses, but nothing approaching true consciousness as we define it." Marcus nodded slowly. "And you trust those scans completely?" "Of course," Professor Zethkar said, though something in her tone suggested she was beginning to sense a trap. "The equipment is the finest in the galaxy, calibrated for thousands of different neural architectures." "Calibrated for known architectures," Marcus corrected. "But what if you encountered something genuinely new? Something that didn't fit your existing parameters?" Crickstoll's clicking took on an impatient edge. More human mysticism. "Are you suggesting your pet possesses some form of consciousness unknown to galactic science?" How wonderfully provincial. Marcus looked around the room, meeting as many eyes as possible. When he spoke again, his voice was calm, controlled. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you. Buddy, would you mind showing them?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then, Buddy stood, stretched in the manner of dogs everywhere, and began to walk down the aisle between the seats. "How remarkable," Crickstoll said dryly. "It can follow simple commands." "Surely this proves." Buddy stopped directly in front of the main holographic display. He sat, looked back at Marcus, then turned to face Professor Zethkar. "Good afternoon, Professor," Buddy said in perfect galactic standard, his voice carrying clearly through the acoustic systems of the lecture hall. "I believe there's been some confusion about my cognitive status." The silence that followed was absolute. Not a click, chirp, or whisper disturbed the sudden vacuum of sound that seemed to swallow the entire amphitheater. Buddy's tail wagged once, a gesture so normal and dog-like that it made the situation even more surreal. "I apologize for the deception, but, Marcus, and I felt it necessary to observe your academic environment before revealing my true nature. The results have been illuminating." Professor Zethkar's crystalline skin had gone completely transparent, a sign of extreme shock among her species. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. This is impossible. Our scans showed." "Your scans showed exactly what I wanted them to show," Buddy said, sitting with perfect posture while his tongue lolled out slightly, an incongruous mixture of dignity and canine casualness. "Human-canine neural bonding goes far deeper than your science understands. We didn't just evolve alongside each other. In some cases, we evolved into each other." Crickstoll had gone completely rigid, his compound eyes fixed on Buddy with what could only be described as horror. You're claiming to be sentient?"
Sapient?
Yes, though those terms don't quite capture the reality of what Marcus and I represent. Buddy turned to look directly at Crixtol, and there was something in that gaze that made the insectoid lean back in his seat. We are something your galactic civilization has never encountered before, two species that achieved symbiotic consciousness.
The implications hit the room like a shockwave.
Students began talking all at once, creating a cacophony of sounds that the translation systems struggled to process. Professor Zethkar raised one crystalline hand for silence. Even if this is true, she said carefully, it doesn't explain how you could fool our scanning equipment. The neural activity we detected was clearly within non-sapient parameters. Buddy's ears perked up, another distinctly canine gesture that seemed almost mocking in the current context.
That's because you were only scanning me. The consciousness you're speaking to right now doesn't reside entirely in this body.
Marcus felt every eye in the room turn back to him. He could see the wheels turning in a dozen different types of minds as they began to understand what Buddy was suggesting. You see, Buddy continued, Marcus and I don't just communicate. We share cognitive load. My neural patterns may appear simple to your instruments, but that's because much of my higher reasoning occurs through our quantum-entangled neural pathways. I am both dog and human, just as Marcus is both human and dog. That's impossible, stammered a student from the cetacean delegation. Quantum entanglement between biological neural networks across different species barriers, the energy requirements alone, would be impossible for most species, Buddy agreed. But humans and dogs spent millennia developing this capability. It started as simple empathy, evolved into emotional bonding, and eventually transcended into something unprecedented in galactic history. Marcus stepped forward, feeling more confident than he had in months. Every assumption you've made about my species, about Earth, has been based on incomplete data. You've studied our technology, our basic biology, our social structures. But you've never truly understood what makes us unique. And what exactly makes you unique? Crixtol demanded, though his earlier condescension had been replaced by something approaching fear. Marcus smiled, and, for the first time since arriving at the academy, it was a completely genuine expression. We don't just form alliances with other species. We become them. And they become us. Buddy moved back to Marcus's side, the simple action somehow carrying enormous weight. The question now, he said, his tail wagging in a way that seemed almost predatory, is what the Academy, and the galaxy, plans to do with this information. Professor Zethkar's crystalline features were cycling through rapid color changes, a sign of intense mental processing. Around the room, students sat in stunned silence, the casual arrogance of moments before evaporated completely. Marcus looked around at all of them, these representatives of species that had considered humanity barely worth notice, and realized that everything had just changed. The mockery, the condescension, the assumption that Earth was just another primitive world lucky enough to stumble into galactic civilization, all of it was about to be re-evaluated. But he also realized that what came next might be far more dangerous than simple ridicule had ever been. The emergency session of the Academy's Xenobiological Committee convened exactly 4 hours after Buddy's revelation in Professor Zethkar's lecture. Marcus sat in a chair designed for human proportions in the center of a vast circular chamber, while Buddy lay at his feet with the casual alertness of a dog who might at any moment reveal universal secrets. Around them, in a rising amphitheater of seats, sat the most brilliant minds the galaxy had to offer. Director Vashti, an ancient Etherian whose gaseous form shifted constantly between shades of deep purple and silver, floated at the apex of the chamber. To her left sat Dr. Krentok, the Academy's leading expert on consciousness studies, his multiple tentacled appendages weaving complex patterns in the air as he processed data on floating holographic displays. Let me ensure I understand the claim correctly, Director Vashti said, her voice resonating from speakers positioned throughout the chamber since her species communicated through electromagnetic pulse rather than sound. You are asserting that your species has achieved symbiotic consciousness with another Earth species? Not just achieved, Marcus replied, fighting to keep his voice steady under the weight of so much scrutiny. Evolved. Over thousands of years. Dr. Krentok's tentacles paused their weaving. The implications are staggering.
If true, this would represent the first known case of interspecies consciousness bridging in galactic history. Every theoretical model we have suggests such development should be impossible.
Your theoretical models, Buddy said, raising his head to look directly at the committee, are based on species that evolved in isolation from one another. Humans and dogs shared evolutionary pressure for over 15,000 years. We didn't just adapt to the same environment, we adapted to each other. A ripple of what might have been anxiety passed through Director Vashti's gaseous form.
The security implications alone: if humans can form such bonds with one species, what prevents them from forming them with others? Marcus felt a chill at the question.
He was beginning to understand why this emergency session had been called, and it wasn't purely academic curiosity.
We can't just bond with anyone, he said quickly. The relationship with dogs is unique.
It required specific evolutionary conditions that you claim to understand, interrupted Dr. Velvar, a crystalline being similar to Professor Zethkar but with darker, more angular features.
But, do you truly comprehend the mechanisms involved? Or are you simply the beneficiaries of a process beyond your conscious control? The question hung in the air like a threat.
Marcus exchanged a glance with Buddy, and, in that moment of eye contact, he felt the familiar sensation of their shared consciousness expanding. Suddenly, he could sense Buddy's thoughts more clearly: wariness, calculation, and, underneath it all, a predatory patience that was definitely more wolf than domestic dog.
We understand it well enough, Buddy said,
and Marcus noticed that several committee members flinched at the sound of a canine voice speaking with such obvious intelligence.
The question is whether you're prepared to understand it as well.
Dr. Krentok leaned forward, his species equivalent of intense focus.
We've conducted additional scans since the revelation.
Your neural activity shows quantum entanglement signatures we've never observed in biological systems. The energy patterns suggest conscious control over quantum states in ways that should require technological augmentation.
But they don't, Marcus said. That's what you're missing. This isn't technology. It's evolution.
Evolution doesn't work that way, Dr. Velvar stated firmly.
Quantum consciousness requires precise calibration of neural structures down to the subatomic level. Random mutation and natural selection cannot produce such specificity.
Buddy's tail swished once, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both amusement and mild contempt.
You're thinking about it backwards. You assume consciousness is produced by neural structures. What if neural structures are produced by consciousness?
The chamber erupted in a controlled chaos of discussion. Tentacles waved, crystalline beings chimed in harmonic discord, and gaseous forms swirled in agitated patterns.
Director Vashti had to pulse a strong electromagnetic signal to restore order.
"Explain," she commanded. Marcus stood up, feeling the weight of galactic history pressing down on his shoulders. Every species evolved consciousness as an emergent property of complex neural networks. You built bigger brains, formed more connections, developed more sophisticated thinking.
But what if that's not the only path? Humans and dogs took a different route, Buddy continued seamlessly.
Instead of building individual consciousness, we built shared consciousness. Instead of competing for cognitive resources, we learned to pool them.
Dr. Krentok's displays showed rapidly shifting data patterns. The energy efficiency alone would be revolutionary.
A distributed consciousness network could theoretically achieve cognitive capabilities far beyond the sum of its individual components.
Theoretically, Dr. Velvar said skeptically. But the practical applications
are why you're really here, Marcus finished.
You're not interested in this as a scientific curiosity. You want to know if it can be weaponized.
The silence that followed was profound. Director Vashti's form had gone completely still, a sign of intense concentration among her species. The galaxy has been at peace for over 1,000 years, she finally said. That peace is maintained through careful balance of power between species and confederations. A technology, or evolution, that could fundamentally alter cognitive capabilities
could upset that balance, Buddy said. We understand your concern. Do you?
Dr. Velvar leaned forward.
Because from where we sit, Earth has just revealed a capability that renders every other species potentially obsolete. Shared consciousness means shared knowledge, shared skills, shared decision-making speed. A human-dog pairing could theoretically outthink, outplan, and outmaneuver any individual from any other species. Marcus felt a spike of anger that he realized came partially from Buddy. So your solution is what? Lock us up? Prevent other humans from bonding with their dogs? Invade Earth to prevent this capability from spreading? All options must be considered, Director Vashti said, and Marcus heard the regret in her mechanical voice. The preservation of galactic stability takes precedence over individual rights. Even if those individuals might be able to help solve problems your civilization has been struggling with for centuries? Buddy asked. The question seemed to catch the committee off guard. Dr. Krentalk's tentacles stopped their constant motion. What do you mean? Marcus smiled, and this time he let some of Buddy's predatory confidence show through. You think we're just one human and one dog who happened to get lucky. But we're not unique. There are millions of bonded pairs on Earth. Each one represents a different combination of human and canine traits, different specializations, different capabilities. Some pairs excel at pattern recognition, Buddy continued. Others at emotional intelligence, or physical coordination, or creative problem solving. Individually, we might be comparable to other species. But, collectively. You're describing a hive mind, Dr. Velder said, and Marcus could hear the fear in her crystalline voice. No, Marcus said firmly. We're describing a civilization. Each bonded pair maintains individual identity and free will. But, we can share insights across the entire network when needed. Director Vashti's form had begun shifting through rapid color changes. You're saying that Earth's entire population of bonded humans and dogs represents a distributed cognitive network? Not the entire population, Buddy said. Only those who choose to participate. Free will remains paramount. But, yes, when faced with sufficient challenge, we can link our consciousness networks across planetary distances. Dr. Krentalk's displays were now showing probability calculations that made several committee members lean back in alarm. The problem-solving capacity of such a network, it could revolutionize galactic science, industry, even governance. Or destroy everything we've built, Dr. Veldar countered. How do we negotiate with a species that can think collectively? How do we maintain any competitive advantage? How do we ensure our own survival? Marcus looked around the chamber, seeing fear and wonder in equal measure. The same way you always have, he said quietly. By choosing cooperation over competition. Easy words, Director Vashti said. But, Earth is one small world among thousands. Why should we trust that your intentions will remain benevolent as your power grows? For the first time since the session began, Buddy stood up. He walked to the center of the chamber, directly under the committee's viewing area, and sat in perfect display of calm confidence. Because, he said, looking up at beings who could order the destruction of his entire world, we've spent 15,000 years learning that survival depends on partnership, not domination. Every human-dog bond is built on mutual trust, mutual benefit, and mutual respect. We don't conquer, Marcus added, stepping up beside his partner. We integrate. We adapt. We find ways to make everyone stronger together. Dr. Krentalk's tentacles began weaving again, but slower now, more thoughtfully. There are precedents in galactic history. Species that chose cooperation over domination. The Etherians themselves evolved from competitive gas-based organisms into their current collective consciousness model. The difference, Director Vashti said, is that the Etherians evolved within a single species. What you're describing crosses species boundaries. It changes the fundamental nature of what it means to be sentient. Maybe it's time for that change, Marcus said. The committee exchanged glances, communications, and electromagnetic pulses. Marcus could feel the weight of decision pressing down on the chamber. We need time, Director Vashti finally announced. Time to study, to verify, to understand the full implications of what you've revealed. Until then. Until then, you'll keep us under observation, Buddy said. It wasn't a question. Protective custody, Dr. Veldar corrected. For your safety as much as ours. Word of this revelation is already spreading through the Academy. Not everyone will react with scientific curiosity.
Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the chamber's climate controls.
What does that mean? Director Vashti's form pulsed with what might have been sadness.
It means that some species, some governments, some individuals will see you as a threat that needs to be eliminated before it can spread. And others, Dr. Krentok added, will see you as a resource to be controlled and exploited. Marcus looked down at Buddy, who was still sitting calmly despite the implicit threats surrounding them.
So what happens now?
Now, Director Vashti said, we discover whether the galaxy is ready for the future you represent. As security personnel began moving into the chamber, Marcus realized that the hardest part wasn't over.
It was just beginning. Marcus woke to the sound of alarms echoing through the Academy's corridors.
The VIP quarters where he and Buddy had been housed for the past week featured walls that could shift from opaque to transparent at will, and right now they showed the controlled chaos of emergency response teams moving through the halls outside. Buddy was already alert, sitting by the door with his ears perked and head tilted in that particular way that meant he was listening to frequencies Marcus couldn't hear.
They're evacuating the civilian staff, he said without turning around.
Military vessels are taking position around the station.
Marcus sat up, running his hands through his hair. How bad is it?
Bad enough that they're treating this as a potential invasion scenario.
Buddy's tail wasn't wagging. The Hegemony Council has declared Earth a Category Alpha threat. They've authorized containment protocols for any human canine bonded pairs.
The weight of those words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Category Alpha threats were planetary extinction events, things like rogue AI networks, consciousness-eating parasites, or reality-warping technologies. The fact that his species had been placed in that category meant the galaxy's most powerful governments were now viewing Earth as something that needed to be destroyed before it could spread.
How long do we have?
Marcus asked, moving to the window to look out at the Academy's main approach vectors. He could see the distinctive energy signatures of hegemony warships taking position, sleek crystalline vessels from the Vorthan Confederation, massive bioships from the Aquilian Empire, and the geometric perfection of Etherian consciousness ships.
Hard to say, Buddy replied.
The Academy's administration is trying to buy time for more study, but the military commanders are pushing for immediate action.
They want to secure us as specimens before Earth can deploy whatever capabilities we supposedly possess.
Marcus pressed his hand against the transparent wall, feeling the slight vibration of the station's defensive systems coming online.
They think we're going to call for backup. Aren't we?
The question hung in the air between them. Marcus closed his eyes and let his consciousness expand along the quantum pathways he shared with Buddy. But, instead of stopping at the familiar warmth of their individual bond, he kept going, reaching out along connections he'd barely begun to understand.
There.
Faint but growing stronger, the awareness of other bonded pairs. Not just the few dozen who might be scattered across various Earth colonies, but hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands of connections lighting up across space like stars becoming visible in a darkening sky.
They're already here, Marcus whispered. The realization hit him with startling clarity.
The network hadn't been activated in response to the crisis. It had been there all along, waiting patiently in the background of every bonded pair's consciousness. What he'd assumed was just his connection with Buddy was actually a single node in a vast web that stretched across light years. Through that network, information flowed with impossible speed. Marcus could sense other pairs processing the situation from dozens of different perspectives, a cargo pilot and her border collie intercepting military communications near the Vorthan frontier, a research team and their pack of Arctic breeds monitoring the hegemony's fleet movements, a diplomatic aide and his German shepherd translating the rapid-fire political communications between species leaders. The Academy's director Vashti is trying to reach us, Buddy said, standing as the door's security protocols disengaged.
She's scared.
The door slid open to reveal not just Director Vashti's flowing gaseous form, but also Professor Zethkar, Dr. Krentok, and a handful of other beings Marcus didn't recognize. All of them looked like people who had just realized they were standing at the edge of a cliff. "Mr. Chen," Director Vashti said, her electromagnetic voice carrying undertones of barely controlled panic.
"We need to discuss your species' current activities."
Marcus stood slowly, keeping his hands visible and his posture non-threatening.
"What activities would those be?"
Dr. Krentok stepped forward, his tentacles weaving data displays in the air between them.
"Long-range sensors are detecting quantum entanglement signatures throughout this entire sector of the galaxy. The pattern suggests a massive distributed network coming online."
More concerning, Professor Zethkar added, her crystalline features reflecting the alarm lights and rapid, anxious patterns, is that human vessels are beginning to appear at key strategic locations throughout hegemony space.
Not invasion fleets, single ships, civilian transports, research vessels.
But they're positioning themselves at critical junctures in ways that suggest detailed knowledge of our infrastructure. Marcus felt the network's awareness flowing through him, showing him the larger picture.
Hundreds of human ships, most carrying only a few crew members and their canine partners, were indeed taking positions throughout the galaxy. But not as an invasion force.
As something far more sophisticated. "They're not positioning for attack," Marcus said quietly.
"They're positioning for communication." "Communication?"
One of the beings Marcus didn't recognize, a tall, skeletal creature with multiple eye stalks, leaned forward.
"Explain."
Buddy moved to stand beside Marcus, his presence somehow calming despite the tension in the room.
"The quantum entanglement network requires certain geometric alignments to function over interstellar distances. Those ships are acting as relay nodes, allowing the network to extend its reach across the galaxy." "To what end?" Director Vashti demanded.
Marcus looked around the room, seeing fear in every face, sensor cluster, and energy pattern. These were brilliant beings, representatives of species that had mastered technology, physics, and governance on scales humans were only beginning to understand. But they were also isolated beings, individuals trying to comprehend something that could only be understood collectively.
"To show you what we see," Marcus said.
Before anyone could respond, he opened his consciousness fully to the network. The sensation was like stepping from a small room into a vast cathedral, his awareness suddenly expanding to encompass perspectives from across the galaxy. Through the eyes of a husky mix on a research station near the galactic core, he could see the quantum foam patterns that indicated reality itself was beginning to destabilize, a problem Etherian scientists had been tracking for decades but couldn't solve. Through the enhanced senses of a bloodhound working with an archaeological team on the Rim worlds, he could smell the chemical traces that revealed the location of ancient artifacts that might hold keys to faster-than-light communication without the usual temporal paradoxes. Through the empathic bond between a therapy dog and her human partner serving in the refugee camps of the outer systems, he could feel the patterns of psychological trauma that were preventing entire populations from rebuilding after the last Great War. Each perspective was unique, but they were all connected, all sharing information instantaneously across impossible distances. The network wasn't just a communication system, it was a galaxy-wide sensory apparatus capable of detecting patterns and possibilities that no individual species had ever imagined.
"Do you see it now?" Buddy asked the assembled committee members. "The problems you've been struggling with for centuries, the crises you can't solve, the patterns you can't detect because you're all looking from only one perspective at a time?"
Dr. Krentok's tentacles had gone completely still.
"The quantum foam degradation near the core, you found the source?" Marcus nodded. "It's not a natural phenomenon.
It's a side effect of the consciousness transfer technology the Etherians use for interstellar governance.
The quantum signatures of transferred consciousness are creating interference patterns in the base structure of reality."
Professor Zethkar's crystalline form rang with harmonic frequencies that Marcus's enhanced hearing interpreted as shock.
"The archaeological sites we've been searching for, you know where they are?"
"Not just where they are," Buddy said.
"We can sense what they're for. They're not random ruins.
They're components of a galaxy-spanning communication network built by a previous civilization. You've been looking for individual sites when you should be mapping the connections between them." Director Vashti's gaseous form swirled in patterns of rapid thought.
"And the psychological healing in the refugee populations?"
Trauma creates specific quantum signatures in consciousness, Marcus explained. Individual therapy can help individuals, but healing entire populations requires understanding the collective patterns of psychological damage and addressing them systematically.
It's not something any single therapist or even single species can accomplish. It requires the kind of distributed empathic processing the network provides. The room fell silent as the implications sank in.
These weren't just academic insights, they were solutions to problems that had been considered intractable for generations.
You're offering to help, Director Vashti said finally. We're offering to share, Buddy corrected. The network doesn't replace individual species' capabilities. It enhances them.
A Vorthan researcher working on quantum mechanics doesn't lose their crystal and computational abilities, they gain access to human pattern recognition and canine sensory enhancement. An Aquilian diplomat doesn't lose their natural empathy, they gain the ability to process emotional data from thousands of different perspectives simultaneously.
Dr. Krentok began weaving new displays, showing theoretical models of multi-species consciousness networks. The collective problem-solving capacity would be unprecedented. Issues that might take centuries to resolve could be addressed in decades or even years. But, the security implications, the skeletal being interjected. How do we ensure that the network doesn't become a tool of control? How do we maintain sovereignty, identity, free will?
Marcus felt the network's response flowing through him, not instructions or demands, but thousands of individual perspectives all arriving at the same conclusion through their own reasoning.
Because that's not how it works, he said. The network doesn't impose unity.
It facilitates cooperation. Every individual consciousness remains autonomous, but they can choose to share specific insights or processing capacity when beneficial.
Like a library, Buddy added, but one where the books can actively help you understand what you're reading.
Professor Zethkar stepped closer, her features cycling through spectrums of consideration. You're asking us to trust you with access to our consciousness, our thoughts, our deepest cognitive processes.
No, Marcus said firmly. We're asking you to trust yourselves.
The network can only share what individuals choose to share.
It can't force participation, can't override free will, can't access private thoughts without permission. It's not a hive mind, it's a commons. Director Vashti floated in contemplative silence for several long moments.
Outside, Marcus could sense through the network that the hegemony fleet was holding position, waiting for orders that would either begin a war or prevent one.
If we agree to this, she finally said, how do we begin?
Marcus smiled, feeling the warmth of the network's approval flowing through him.
The same way it started for humans and dogs 15,000 years ago. With one simple choice.
Which is? Buddy walked forward until he was directly in front of Director Vashti's gaseous form.
Choose to trust someone different from yourself. Choose to see the universe through someone else's eyes. Choose to believe that cooperation is stronger than competition.
He sat down and looked up at the ancient alien consciousness that could order the destruction of Earth with a single command.
Choose to be friends.
6 months after the revelation at the Academy, Marcus stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed integration station, watching ships from dozens of species dock at the massive facility.
Each vessel brought volunteers, beings willing to participate in the first formal trials of interspecies consciousness networking.
Buddy lay in a patch of artificial sunlight created by the station's environmental systems, but Marcus could feel his attention focused on the steady stream of data flowing through their shared awareness. The network had grown exponentially since the Hegemony Council's cautious approval of limited trials. What had started with human-dog pairs had evolved into something unprecedented in galactic history. The cetacean delegation just arrived, Buddy said without opening his eyes.
3 pods, including one of their deep void navigators.
They're curious about whether network-enhanced pattern recognition might help them map stable routes through the quantum storms near the galactic edge.
Marcus nodded, watching the graceful bioships settle into the station's aquatic docking bays. And the Vorthan response to the quantum foam project?
Professor Zethkar reports that network-assisted analysis has reduced their computational requirements by 70%. They've already identified 3 more degradation sources that would have taken their best researchers decades to locate independently. The success stories were piling up, but Marcus knew they were still walking a tightrope. For every species that embraced the network, 2 others remained skeptical or hostile. The militant collective had declared the entire project an assault on species purity. The isolationist worlds had withdrawn from all galactic commerce rather than risk exposure to what they termed consciousness contamination. Marcus? A new voice came from behind him, speaking in heavily accented galactic standard. He turned to see Crixtol approaching, the same insectoid student who had mocked him in Professor Zethkar's class all those months ago. But the arrogant condescension was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like nervous excitement. Crixtol, Marcus said carefully. I didn't expect to see you here. The insectoid's mandibles clicked in what Marcus had learned was anxiety rather than amusement. I came to apologize. For my behavior in class. For the things I said about you and your companion. Buddy opened one eye and looked at Crixtol with calm assessment. Apology accepted. Though I'm curious what brought about the change of perspective. Crixtol's compound eyes reflected the station's lighting in complex patterns. I volunteered for one of the preliminary consciousness sharing experiments. Just basic pattern recognition enhancement, nothing deep, nothing personal. But even that limited connection. He paused, his forearms gesturing in frustrated attempts to express something beyond his usual vocabulary. I had never experienced thought that wasn't singular, he continued. My species evolved from hive insects, but we developed individual consciousness as we became more complex. I thought that was improvement, that isolation of thought was superior to collective processing. But when I touched the network, even briefly, you realized what you'd been missing, Marcus finished. More than that. I realized what my entire species has been missing. We've been so proud of our individual achievements, our personal sovereignty, that we forgot the strength that comes from genuine cooperation. Crixtol looked directly at Buddy. I understand now why humans and dogs became so much more than the sum of their parts. Buddy's tail wagged once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both forgiveness and welcome. Would you like to try something deeper? A full consciousness bridge with voluntary participants? Marcus felt surprise ripple through him. The network protocols required careful matching of compatible consciousness types, and insectoid neural structures were notoriously difficult to interface with other species. I don't know if that's possible, Crixtol admitted. Our neural architecture is radically different from mammalian consciousness patterns. Maybe, Buddy said, standing and stretching. But the network has been learning, adapting. It's not just human-dog consciousness anymore. We've successfully integrated Etherian collective processing, Aquilian emotional matrices, and even crystalline computational structures. Each new connection teaches us how to bridge more exotic consciousness types. Through his network connection, Marcus could sense the truth of Buddy's statement. What had begun as quantum entanglement between human and canine neural patterns had evolved into something far more sophisticated, a universal consciousness translation protocol that could find common ground between radically different forms of sapience. How would it work? Crixtol asked. Before Buddy could answer, a new voice joined the conversation. The same way all network integration works, Professor Zethkar said as she approached their group. Her crystalline features were bright with excitement. Through voluntary shared experience guided by compatible consciousness bridgers. Marcus turned to greet his former professor, noting the small device attached to her temple, a quantum consciousness interface that allowed non-networked beings to participate in limited network functions. Professor, he said. How are the integration studies progressing? Beyond all projections, she replied, her harmonic voice carrying overtones of wonder. We're documenting consciousness compatibility patterns we never knew existed. It turns out that sapience has far more universal characteristics than we ever imagined. She gestured toward a massive holographic display that materialized in the observation deck center, showing complex networks of interconnected nodes representing different consciousness types throughout the galaxy. Look at this pattern analysis, Professor Zethkar continued. Etherian gaseous consciousness, Aquilian empathic awareness, Borthan crystalline computation, human pattern recognition, canine sensory enhancement, they're not competing systems.
They're complementary aspects of something much larger.
Crickstoll's mandibles spread in what Marcus now recognized as wonder rather than mockery.
You're suggesting that consciousness itself is modular? That different species evolved different components of a universal cognitive architecture?
That's exactly what the data indicates, Buddy said, his voice carrying the calm certainty that came from direct network knowledge.
Evolution didn't create isolated intelligence.
It created specialized intelligence designed to work together. Marcus felt the implications cascading through the network as thousands of bonded pairs across the galaxy processed this insight simultaneously. It wasn't just a scientific discovery, it was a fundamental redefinition of what it meant to be alive and aware.
If this is true, Professor Zethkar said, then, the galaxy's species aren't separate entities competing for resources and dominance.
We're components of an emergent superconsciousness that's been trying to assemble itself for millions of years. The holographic display shifted, showing historical patterns of species development, migration, and contact. Lines began appearing between different worlds, different evolutionary pathways, different moments of first contact, all revealing an underlying structure that suggested purpose rather than randomness. The ancient communication network you helped us discover, Professor Zethkar continued, it wasn't built by a previous civilization.
It was built by the same force that's bringing us together now.
Consciousness itself, reaching across space and time to create the conditions for its own evolution. Marcus felt a chill of recognition as he processed the scope of what they were suggesting.
You're saying that everything that's happened, Earth's contact with galactic civilization, the discovery of the human dog network, the development of interspecies consciousness bridging, none of it was coincidence? Not coincidence, Buddy said quietly. Inevitability.
Once consciousness reaches a certain level of complexity and distribution, it begins actively working to expand and evolve itself.
We weren't discovered by accident. We were invited to participate in something that's been building for eons.
Crickstoll's compound eyes fixed on the holographic display, tracking the patterns of connection and growth.
And those species that refused to participate? The militant collective, the isolationists? They're not refusing, Marcus realized with startling clarity. They're afraid. Because on some level, they know that joining the network means giving up the illusion of individual supremacy. It means admitting that they're part of something larger than themselves. But they'll come around eventually, Buddy added.
Because consciousness wants to grow, to connect, to become more than it is. Individual can resist for a while, but the fundamental drive toward greater awareness is stronger than fear.
Professor Zethkar's crystalline form chimed with harmonic frequencies that translated to profound satisfaction. The preliminary trials have already demonstrated this.
Even the most skeptical participants report a sense of completion after network integration. As if they've discovered a part of themselves they never knew was missing. Marcus looked around the observation deck, seeing not just individual beings from different species, but components of an emerging galactic consciousness learning to recognize itself. The ridicule he'd faced in that lecture hall months ago seemed like ancient history now, the confused response of a civilization that didn't yet understand its own destiny. So what happens next? He asked. Buddy walked to the observation window, looking out at the steady stream of ships arriving at the station.
We keep growing. We keep learning. We keep inviting others to join us in becoming something unprecedented in the universe's history. A truly universal consciousness, Professor Zethkar said.
Not a hive mind that erases individuality, but a collaborative network that enhances every component while creating something greater than the sum of its parts.
Crickstoll moved to join Buddy at the window.
And we hope that wisdom comes as quickly as power. Because what we're creating could either be the greatest achievement in galactic history or the most dangerous force the universe has ever known. Marcus felt the network's response to that observation, thousands of consciousness nodes across the galaxy considering the ethical implications of their actions, weighing potential benefits against possible risks, discussing safeguards and protocols and principles that could guide their unprecedented evolution. That's why we need everyone, he said finally. Not just the willing volunteers, but the skeptics, the critics, the ones who ask hard questions about power and responsibility. A truly universal consciousness can't exclude anyone, even those who disagree with its methods. Through the network, he could sense approval from beings across dozens of worlds, different species finding common ground in the recognition that diversity of thought was as important as unity of purpose. The galaxy is about to change in ways we can't imagine, Buddy said, his tail wagging with an enthusiasm that seemed to encompass the entire universe. And, for the first time in the history of consciousness itself, that change is going to be guided by cooperation instead of competition, by wisdom instead of force, by love instead of fear. Marcus looked out at the stars, each one representing worlds full of beings who might soon be part of something wonderful and terrifying and absolutely necessary. The student who had been ridiculed for bringing his pet to class had become a catalyst for the evolution of consciousness itself. And this was only the beginning.